Welcome back to the Road to Great Health podcast. I'm Dr. Kevin Lenderman from South Louisiana, and I am joined by the man, Dr. Rob DeMartino out of Las Vegas, and we're back from vacation.
I know, the both of us, right? 2 weeks off, vacations for
Both
each.
of
I
us.
love it.
Yeah. So Dr. Rob, 2 weeks ago, he said, I'm going to be out next week. I have vacation. We'll be back to next week. I said, no, I'm out the following week. So we are back and ready to go. And we have a very important subject for you today. We're going to talk about lupus, which is an autoimmune condition. And we're also going to talk about an autoimmune marker on blood work called ANA. And so we're going to get into all the details about that. And Doc, one of the things that I wanted to start with, and I see very often that always kind of puzzles me, is the patient will come in and say, I have a positive ANA, but my doctor said I don't have anything wrong.
Yeah, that's a new trend. That changed
Yeah.
over the last handful of years. That was never the way that they looked at that before. But really what that ultimately means is they'll run the ANA. It's a kind of a general marker. It means anti-nuclear antibodies, right? So your immune system is sniffing around the nucleus of the cell. But then they'll do reflex testing, which means they'll look at different patterns that will exist underneath ANA. And that will help you with the diagnoses, right? So then you get, okay, it's lupus or it's Sjogren's or it's scleroderma or it's mixed connective tissue disorder, whichever one of the disease falls into those categories. And if they don't find any of those patterns, then they say, well, we can't name the disease, so you're fine.
Yeah.
And
We'll just watch it. My favorite, one of our favorite medical terms, right?
We'll just assume your immune system has some sort of problems with your nucleus, and that's probably fine, right? So, and even if you look it up, it'll say, like, I was curious because I was looking it up beforehand because I know that there's this representation that they say, well, sometimes healthy people will have this, and they say about 15% of the population has this positive, even if they're very, very healthy. And I will tell you that there's no such thing as that. What that
Right.
means, and really in translation, is that it's not severe enough to be able to be categorized as a specific disease yet, but it's still a problem.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, the bottom floor of the house is on fire, but the whole house isn't burning yet. So we're just going to watch it, and then we'll see if we can put the fire out once it engulfs the whole house.
Yeah, exactly. Right. They're going to deal with the spread. I mean, and then that's
Yeah.
the symptom management game of it, but it's a significant finding and it needs to be treated as such. But in the last few years, they've kind of minimized it quite a bit.
Yeah. Now, anti-nuclear antibodies. So is that meaning that there's antibodies to the nucleus of the cell?
Yeah. So the body is starting to sniff around where your DNA is housed, that your body is starting to sniff around that there is a problem there. And it's obviously a big finding. It's an important area of the cellular structures. We're going to talk about,
Yeah.
how a lot of those things occur because I'll tell you, doing history with these patients is like throwing darts. They're almost all exactly the same. They have almost exactly the same story, exactly the same history, exactly the same medication uses. And that's the part that kind of typically gets missed because they don't talk about how these things actually get there. But if somebody has a positive ANA and they get one of the reflex diagnoses, they're just going to go to rheumatology, and rheumatology is going to use what we call the four horsemen of rheumatology, right? It's the Plaquenil, it's hydroxychloroquine, it's the prednisone, it's the methotrexate, right? These are the four drugs that they use for all of those different types of problems in some sort of combination or the other. But really has no conversation around why this happens, what in history happens, what makes it start, how do you make it potentially go away? Those are the things that we obviously really want to get into today. But again, think about it. The ideology of your immune system saying that there's some sort of problem with that part of your cell is nothing to sneeze at, right? It's an important thing.
Yeah. The nucleus is kind of important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So walk me through what goes on in your head whenever you see positive ANA on blood work. What are some of the things that you start thinking?
So we start asking real specific questions about history, right? So history is actually the first and the most important thing when it comes down to this. And we start asking questions, especially about at any point in life, but especially at a very young age. Was there any time where there was a lot of use of antibiotics? Right. So we're looking for antibiotic use. We're looking for, was there a lot of strep infections? Right. So that's sore throat. tonsillitis, having tonsils taken out? Is there a lot of ear infections, ear tubes, a constant need for antibiotics for that? It could not be in those two, and it could be staph. I've seen it be with staph infections as well too. But 80% of the time, it's going to be between strep and staph, or there's going to be a time frame in life where somebody had a long-term use of antibiotics or a lot of use of antibiotics, and a lot of the times that this was in childhood. And it's so funny because every time I sit with somebody who has this antibody and I ask them these questions, they get this look on their face like, how did you know that? And sometimes I have to get real specific, right? Like, did you have a lot of infections as a kid? No. Did you have to have like your tonsils out of your ears, have tubes? Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's kind of what I meant by that, right? So again, it looks past it, but we are. Oh yeah, I was on antibiotics all the time, and it's typically a problem that's triggered by antibiotics. It's usually precluded by a strep infection. That's the thing that they tend to want to go for. Strep tends to drive with ANA, but it's the use of the antibiotics, and we'll get into all this, but it's the use of the antibiotics for those infections at an earlier point at life that eventually causes the damage that the immune system is then looking for when we start getting an ANA positive. What type of problem, whether it's lupus or scleroderma, it depends upon where the damage in the cellular structure occurs, right? Antibiotics will damage them where it occurs in that cell structure, and that's going to depend a bit more on the person. But that's what disease that they will get. But the causation of it typically almost always traces back to an antibiotic. It could be other meds, and I've seen it triggered by other meds. But again, 90 something percent of the time, it's going to be antibiotic use for strep throat infection type things.
Yeah, I was talking to a young lady just this morning that and she was a teenager and her mom was in there with her, and I was asking her about previous infections, and she had tubes, she had tons of antibiotics, and then I asked her about strep throat, and she said, "Yeah, I think I had that some." And her mom chimed in and said, "You had strep throat over 20 times between, like, 14 years old and 17, 18 years old." So reoccurring strep, and of course, ANA positive, the whole thing. Yeah, so it's definitely a pattern.
Yeah, I had the same conversation with a patient day before yesterday. We were talking, and we finished her consult, and she's like, hey, and she was an ANA patient, and we're on maintenance now, thankfully. But she's like, hey, I got to ask you another question. It has nothing to do with me. I was like, sure. It's like my granddaughter's got ANA, right? So she was having hip problems. They took her to an orthopedist. He did an imaging, and he's like, do you have any kind of lupus or autoimmune disease in the family? Because that's not hip damage. That's an autoimmune disease. And so, of course, her grandma was like, yep, that's me. So she immediately calls me, and we kind of hook up with that. But she's like, but yeah, it was the same thing. My son's strep throat all the time, granddaughter, strep throat all the time, antibiotic uses for it. She's like, we just didn't know any better. And now she's 19 years old, and she has this issue. So yes, the pattern is like throwing darts. It's over and over and over and over again. We just keep having the same conversations, but that's not out there in mainstream medicine.
Right. Absolutely. And dividing that ANA into all of those other flags, one or two of those flags could be multiple different things. So sometimes it's still not even specific from there. Like, I think the speckled one is like 6 or 7 different diseases that one could be, the speckled ANA.
Right.
You still have to narrow it down some from there with clinical.
Yeah, you ask questions, and again, at the same time, once you start having this bigger understanding of the biophysics of the body and where this all kind of comes from, you're going to the mitochondria. You're going to have to try
Right.
to fix that
Yeah.
that problem
Eh,
there.
Yeah.
You end up with the separate problem of potentially dealing with some of this remnant strep. You end up with the separate problem of trying to deal with the nucleus of the cell and this medication toxicity that's probably been there typically by the time they get to us for a lengthy period of time, because like, usually these people are adults coming into me, but this problem and this medication happened when they were younger, children and stuff like that. So these problems can be dormant for quite some time, but it's just accruing damage at all time until it's enough to rear its head.
Yeah, I was explaining that to a patient or earlier before I came on the podcast. They were so stuck on it was a chronic fatigue patient, and they just kept coming back to their diagnosis, this chronic fatigue diagnosis, and and so they were so stuck in what to call it. It was hard to get them off of that and into what's causing it. And so when Dr. Rob and I are talking to a patient, yes, the diagnosis is important, but the most important question is, why is that diagnosis there? labeling it and putting it in a code and typing that code in the computer and billing it and prescribing for it and going on to the next patient doesn't ever address the question of why does this patient have this at this time. And so many times patients come in so caught up on the label instead of the why it's there. Sometimes we got to get them to shift their thinking a little bit.
Yeah, and I get it too, because you wanted to, like,
Yeah.
because the feeling is if you can name it, then you know what you're dealing with, and then there's going to be some sort of outcome to it. Unfortunately, that's not really typically the way it works within diagnoses, because you could name it,
Right.
and they're like, okay, it's still going to be those four meds.
Right.
Or like I can tell you what they're going to do from here, right? It's not like they're going to change what they do depending upon what that is. It's just still going to be one of those four medications. They just need a code, like you were saying, in order to be able to document that in there. And not to soapbox it, but chronic fatigue is one of those that I find just a baffling thing, because there's so much confusion. Like, well, chronic fatigue is so complicated. Is it really? Right? If you don't have enough energy to run your body, doesn't it make sense that we look to the parts of your body that make energy? In our case, mitochondria is what makes energy, right? So, but they're like, well, we don't really know what causes chronic fatigue. Like, well, wouldn't it be the system in your body that makes energy? Like, where else would
Right.
you look? Like, what else do you think it could possibly be, right? So,
Right.
it's an interesting one where there's a diagnosis. There's no real way, like, there's no chronic fatigue marker in your blood work like there is for ANA. But again, number one search trend on Google for years now is chronic fatigue, because everybody wants more energy. Even if you got great energy, you want more energy. But again, it doesn't leave, oh, you have this chronic fatigue diagnosis, but almost sometimes it sends them into more of a spiral because there's no answer within that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So let's get into lupus a little bit, Doc, because I'm seeing more and more cases of lupus. When I first started doing this 30 years ago, we saw some, but it seems like we're getting more and more people diagnosed with full blown lupus.
Yeah, and again, if you look at the trends, it'll go straight up as antibiotics go up, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to talk about the way that antibiotics work, and then the way obviously that the body handles infectious stuff. So if you
Let's
get
let's
an
do that
infection,
because that is a fascinating conversation. So yeah, let's get into that.
yeah, I think it's an important one for this one too, and it's interesting too because there's a big American twist to this, right?
Mhm.
That the rest of the world thinks about this very differently than the way that we do. And I was lucky enough that there was a bunch of German and Swiss doctors who came to the U.S. to teach some of their ideologies of functional medicine. And I happened to know people who knew people, and I got into the first round of the course, and they were going to do this whole course, and there was going to be multiple rounds of it, but they got shut down before the first course ended, and they got shut down. So I was lucky
Yeah.
enough that I happened to be one of the students in that first course. But if
Yeah.
I had waited or didn't make that first one, I would have never made it to it. Um, so when there's an infection, right? So there's a bacteria inside your body. We're going to play this out, and it's usually strep when it comes to lupus, right? So if there's a strep infection inside your system, your white blood cells are going to go up to it, and it's basically going to swallow it, right? It's going to grab it whole, and it's going to swallow it up and chew the whole things up. But antibiotics don't work like that. Antibiotics will come in like a heat-seeking missile, and they'll basically hit the infection and cause it to explode. Right. So it would be like akin to me taking some glass and saying, I don't want this, and smashing it on the ground. And afterwards, I'm like, okay, that was a bit of an overreaction. Now I got to go pick up all this glass and get rid of it. And I could pick up the glass, but little shards of it will start to get buried into the carpet, and they can create problems if you don't see them and you're walking barefoot. Right. So this is what we call cell wall deficient bacteria. So what makes a bacteria or anything infectious is that it has an intact cell wall. And the interesting thing about an intact cell wall, so basically it means it's a whole structure. When you have an intact cell wall, it's also what allows infections to be cultured, infectious agents to be cultured. So if you've ever had strep throat, they stick the Q-tip in the back of your throat and they choke you for a second, and then they rub it on the petri dish and they say, we'll call you later, and they go and they check, they get that to ferment, and then it comes back and say, okay, yeah, you have strep throat, right? You have strep, and we'll give you X, Y, and Z medication. But when you use an antibiotic for that and it destroys the cell wall, now it actually can't be cultured, because the cell, without the lack of the cell wall, it can't be cultured. So the interesting thing is, in the United States, even though there are books written about cell wall deficient bacteria, even though there is hardcore research outside of the United States that links cell wall deficient bacteria, especially in the form of strep, causing ANA and lupus type of disorders, inside the US, the idea of cell wall deficiency does not exist, because in order for something to be categorized as an infection in the United States, it has to be able to be cultured. And because cell wall deficient bacteria can't be cultured, because we cause most of the cell wall deficient bacteria by overuse of antibiotics. And you've mentioned many times about it's not even just taking antibiotics, it's all within our food source, right? You do a good job of bringing that up in our podcast because sometimes I'll gloss over that, but you always make me come back to that. Like, yeah, it's true. Food source is a huge portion of antibiotics. Because we are so heavy usage of antibiotics, we get a ton of this cell wall deficient bacteria. So now you get these little pieces of the bacteria that can get into different parts of your body. And when they get in there, they confuse your immune system, right? So now your immune system is going wild and it starts carpet bombing everything in the area, trying to get this little piece of bacteria that's now kind of hidden inside the system. But if it does that, it's going to create this whole autoimmune type of reaction. So we have the one side of this where we've got this negative reaction to these bacterial fragments that we've caused by overuse of antibiotics. And then, which we'll talk about here in a second, you have this whole second side of this then too, where the antibiotics themselves actually damage parts of the cell itself. They're called the mitochondria, which are bacterial in origin. So if you're taking an antibacterial, it's going to damage the mitochondria, which triggers an autoimmune reaction. So in lupus, we get this double-fanged reaction here that we've got these antibiotic-caused fragments of bacteria that's confusing the hell out of your immune system. And then the antibiotics themselves actually damage the cellular structures, triggering damage to certain parts of the cell. They're called ribosomes. And then ribosome damage leads to positive ANAs. So again, outside the US, like when I did this training with these German doctors, they kind of laughed at us. Like I remember talking to them and I was laughing. I was like, we were saying like, man, the lupus is tough. And the guy literally laughed in my face because he's like, it's not tough at all. He's like, but you're American. Which I was kind of like offended by, but I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And then when he went through the course, he explained it. I was like, I've been through everything. Like I go to seminars constantly. I've been everywhere. I've listened to everybody. And the concept of cell wall deficient bacteria was never taught to me because all my training was in the US. And I was pissed when I went to my hotel room that night and I busted out my computer and I went on and I searched cell wall deficient bacteria and I see there's books and there's this and there's all these papers and everything linking this. And no one has never once mentioned it to me.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I had never heard of cell wall deficient bacteria either until, till you taught us about it, 10, 15 years ago now. And I just find that fascinating that, we think antibiotics are killing an infection just like your immune system kills an infection. And the two methods of operation are totally different there. One is like putting a glass in a trash bag and breaking it. The other one is just throwing it on the floor. And it makes a huge difference whenever you start recognizing there's other things other than just this American way of thinking whenever it comes to getting sick people well.
It was really quite an eye-opening experience to be there with them because their viewpoints on things were so different, right? And these were the guys who they ran the clinics like where our rich and famous people, like our presidents, our actors and actresses, when they got sick, they flew over there and they treated with them. And actually, that doctor now has since retired. One of my mentors, he's since retired now, but it was a wildly different conversation than anything we'd ever had here. But I was also again blown away by how much documentation there was around this, and then for a very, very, very long period of time, and it was just never being dealt with that way, right? They were just saying, well, again, we don't know. But then it was funny because then I came back to clinical practice and I started asking questions of my ANA patients. I'm like, hey, do you guys have, do you have this history? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Right. Every time. And it was time. It was 99% accurate. And I'm going, oh man, these guys are definitely onto something. And then all of a sudden, when you start using those ideologies, these problems all of a sudden start doing very, very well. And it can create a lot of confusion in the medical world, but again, they also have to be very, very careful about potentially using antibiotics sometime later in life. And we'll talk about the mitochondrial side of it, but that piece of data was worth its weight in education for me of going to that course because that was wildly eye opening.
Super interesting. And so sometimes we even see that on live blood. We'll see a white blood cell completely engulf. It's like it wraps its arms around something bad and completely engulfs it where there's nothing can get out and it deals with it inside. Whereas antibiotics don't do that. It blows it apart.
Yeah, I
And
like the
so,
analogy of breaking it inside the bag. That's a good one.
yeah, Yeah. Let's get into how that then goes and damages the mitochondria.
Yeah. So what'll end up happening is when this bacteria free floats, right, it confuses the immune system because your immune system is looking for that cell wall, right? And if that bacteria gets into different parts of the cellular structure, it's going to trigger it to send out a signal that there's danger, right? So the cells themselves are always signaling back and forth to each other, but it's always going to be able to signal out to the immune system saying, hey, there's a case of danger here. And there's no real way of being able to know how much of this in a pie chart is coming from the bacterial fragments themselves, how much of it is coming from the mitochondrial damage, right? Because mitochondria will get specifically damaged by certain antibiotics, right? Certain antibiotics will damage mitochondria in different ways. The worst ones are the type of antibiotics that are fluoride based. I've had quite a few patients trigger ANAs after surgicals because the one thing they don't talk a lot about is anesthesia is a fluoride-based medication. And fluoride is incredibly toxic to the human body, and fluoride is incredibly toxic to your mitochondria. It is incredibly electronegative, which damages mitochondrial function. So, like the fluoroquinolones, any of those guys are fluoride based and they are ugly medications. In fact, SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are also fluoride based medications too. So that happens quite a bit where it can cause all kind of damage. But so it's hard to tell what comes what, but when the antibacterial medication damages the bacterial origin of the mitochondria, one way versus the other, those cells are going to start to signal the immune system saying, hey, we are damaged, or there's an intruder in here that shouldn't be in here, and we need help. And your immune system is going to be the one that gets that call, just like calling 911 for the police. And they're going to run to the area and it's going to start pumping out all these other inflammatory chemicals, which all of the drugs, the four horsemen of rheumatology we talked about before, all those drugs then are designed to reduce the amount of inflammation that your immune system cells are going to throw out at your mitochondria once they're damaged. Right. But all that's doing is leaving the damage in the mitochondria and stopping your immune system from being able to potentially fix this issue, find that infection, kill it, or, repair ultimately the mitochondrial function. Right. At some point, it's either going to have to be the resolution of the problem, which is fixing the mitochondria, getting that infection to go away, getting the immune system to call off its dogs, or just basically unplugging your cell's ability to call 911, despite the fact that there's an intruder in the house, right? You still want to be able to
Yeah.
call out at that point. But
Right.
that's why all of a sudden you see, okay, now I have one autoimmune disease, now I have two autoimmune disease, now I have three autoimmune disease, now I have four autoimmune disease, because this damage is running rampant, and all we're doing is controlling symptoms. Which, again, when people are in discomfort, there's this obvious draw towards that. But you've got this rolling fire, and we're just unplugging smoke detectors.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's less annoying on your ears, but it means the fire is still rolling, and we're just going to keep causing more damage, which triggers more diagnoses somewhere down the road.
Yeah. Now, the way I understand cell wall deficient bacteria too, one other thing we didn't cover as well on that is the way your immune system determines if something is a foreign invader and it's bad for you is that it bumps into that cell wall and it reads it like a USB charger. And it
Yep.
will bump into that cell wall and say, this is a bacteria, I need to attack this. Or it'll bump in and say, oh, that's a human cell, leave that one alone. And if you lose that cell wall because the antibiotic has sort of blown it off, your immune system bumps into that and it doesn't know what to do. Is that
Yeah,
right?
it doesn't know. Yeah, it does. It can't plug in, right? So there has to be a
Yeah.
connection towards it. And it reads that protein structure and it says, oh, okay, this is a cell wall. This is a bacteria. This shouldn't be here. I got to eat this up. Right. But when we basically almost cloak it in a way because we've damaged it. And if you look up cell wall deficient bacteria, sometimes you'll also see it referred to as L form bacteria,
Yeah.
just in case somebody's researching off of this. And they call it L form because it was discovered at the Lister Institute in England. So they named it L form. But it has to be able to identify it. Right. It's all of what your immune. Think about what autoimmunity is, right? They always talk about, well, your immune system can't identify things. Well, if we create fragments of bacteria that your immune system can't identify, it's going to cause a tremendous amount of confusion, right? And then these fragments can get into places that they shouldn't be able to get into because there's never fragments of bacteria that get into our system, right? It's always whole chunks of this. But again, this always runs back. And I think the resistance to being able to, because I've asked every lab in the United States, like, hey, would you test cell wall deficient bacteria for me? There is not a lab out here that will do it. That there's one that I found. We used to ship it to like overseas, which was a royal pain because half the time trying to get out of Vegas, it's 8,000 degrees right now, so like it dies up before it tries to get out there. But they won't do it in the U.S. because it violates the what they call the Koch postulates, which is how we identify something as a bacteria, and then they wouldn't be able to stay in business because they would go against U.S. code. So it is a wild phenomenon that needs to be addressed. And there's easy ways of handling this from a natural medicine ideology, but A, you have to know that it's there. B, you have to have this understanding of it. And then you have to deal with maybe progressively worsening things. So we're talking about a bacteria that gets in. We're talking about an infection that happens that gets to a place it shouldn't be. And we're talking about antibiotics damaging mitochondria. But the other part of this that can get really involved is they'll start to spill all of this material. Like these cells will damage, and that material, that damaged mitochondria, that mitochondrial DNA will spill out into the cell structure. And now you've got more bacterial remnants and viral remnants that looks like, oh, that's spilling into the blood system. And that makes your immune system go wild because, again, now it's going to signal to the immune system. It says, we have to go in and mop this up. So your red blood cells help you mop it up. And now all of a sudden they come in with associated anemia because now all their red blood cells get super inflamed. Their iron levels tank, right? And then they say, oh, you need iron. They don't need iron. They need to, their red blood cells are mopping up all this damage that's creating all of this different types of problems. And, obviously I think it's important that we get into the sunlight component of this because that's always a big conversation around the lupus side of things because they tend to be sensitive towards sunlight. But it's this very linear cascade, but it's hard to test beyond just getting a positive ANA, right? Your job, my job is we have to know these things, right? Like there's nothing I test to do that. I have to know how this happens. I have to know the questions to ask in history. I have to understand the science, and then I have to apply what I have to fix that science once that ANA triggers, hey, this is going on. But again, we like to see what we can feel and touch. There is nothing that lays this all out. You just have to be able to know this and have a grasp on that science. And once you do that, these problems become much more explainable and understandable, and the outcomes get significantly better versus the traditional thing of, hey, we don't know what causes this, just take these medications to reduce the inflammation.
Yeah, instead of just you're unlucky and got lupus. Like there's reasons for this to happen. So you mentioned sunlight, Doc. That was going to be one of the questions that I had closing up here. So a person with lupus is sensitive to the sun, but light is what they actually need to heal. So talk a little bit about how to square that and how you deal with that and sort of why is that like that?
Yeah, so it's every time I make videos on social media, and I always talk about sunlight being such an important driver when it comes to reversing autoimmune disease. I always have to make the preface, except for my lupus friends, right? I know you guys are going to struggle
Right.
with sunlight, and this is one of those things. So the damage to the mitochondrial structures releases a chemical called interferon. And interferon, when it gets in high levels, is what makes a person sensitive to UV style sunlight, right? It's what gives them the rash. It what makes their skin not be able to deal with it. The unfortunate portion of this story is the hormone in the body that protects the part of your cell that when it gets damaged, it releases interferon is vitamin D, right? And you get vitamin D from UV sunlight. So the irony of this is it's a lack of vitamin D or a lack of UV sunlight that allows the cell in that place to be damaged. Because a lot of people take antibiotics. They're like, well, why doesn't everybody get this? Well, it depends upon those statuses, right? If that vitamin D is good, they're not going to leach interferon. So we have to know that. So we have to use we have to use sunlight spectrums that are not in the UV spectrum first. And that's typically going to occur in like that first hour from sunrise in the morning. And they may only be able to do micro dosages of that. But the more you absorb that sun, the more it'll drop inflammatory stuff, especially if you do it while grounding. That will allow all that to work. So then it allows you to be able to tolerate more UV light later in the day. Now, again, that has to go slow. Now, we have methodologies within clinic. Okay, how do we drive interferon down fast? right? Start fixing that part of the cell. We drive the interferon down fast. So then all of a sudden we can tolerate more sunlight because that chemical is lower. But from their perspective, it's the way out, but their rock in their hard place is the damage is partly causing an effect there that's going to make it hard for them to get that light. So that's where they get a bit stuck. But there are pathways out of it, but they have to leverage the non-UV portion of light to build up with that over the course of time to where that they can start taking UV in small dosages. And again, it might be micro dosages, but the old expression is the only way out is through. That's the pathway through, right? But there's ways of expediting that process to make it much easier.
Yeah, there definitely is with some of the technologies that we use, but they end up on this catch-22. Like the doctor tells them to stay out of the sun. They feel bad when they go in the sun, so they get less sun, so they get worse, so they stay out of the sun more, and they end up on this downward spiral of, you just have to help them climb out of that with some of this technology and, the early morning red light first, and then slow exposures of UV over time. And you can build a person out of this. I mean, I know we've both done it several times, but you just have to know those steps and what to start with so that they can tolerate those UVs enough to start to heal.
Yeah, and an important ideology too is vitamin D in a supplement form will not do this.
Will not do
right.
this.
So vitamin
Exactly
D
right.
does not drive that level down at the level. So people say, well, I can just take vitamin D. The disservice that they did to all of us was they named it vitamin D, even though it's not a vitamin, but it's a hormone.
Yeah.
Right. So vitamin D is only called vitamin D for, just research purposes of when they found it, they just named it a vitamin, but it actually is only a hormone that your body makes from sunlight. So when we made it vitamin, it sounds like it's something you need to be eating, but it's not. It's something that you're meant to get from sunlight. You kind of got into a bit of a situation where that D level was low, that antibiotic hit and did the damage, and now we're stuck, like you were saying. But the unfortunate portion is the vitamin D portion is not going to get you out of it. Not taking vitamin D, not taking mega dosages of it. Even though your vitamin D will look low and it'll go up, it won't offset this cascade of what we're talking about.
No, you got to deal with it in a clinical setting, and you have to work through these problems one at a time that we've been talking about, and that's what we do every single day here at our offices is work through these issues. Well, man, Doc, today was a good one, man. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did as well. And if you're struggling with lupus or you have a positive A and you don't have lupus yet, that doesn't mean the house is not on fire. It just means the fire is still small, and it's something that the sooner we get to it, the better. Well, if you guys enjoyed this, you want to know more about it, share this with somebody that has lupus or that's struggling with health problems. We'd love to help them. And our websites are at the top. You're welcome to check those out. Doc, thanks a lot, man. It's been another good one. And we will be back next week. No more vacations.
No more vacations. No more vacations. Back to work.
All right, back to work. Thanks, guys.